My name is Erwin Chemerinsky. I'm Dean and Professor of Law at the University of California School of Law. My goal is to provide you a thorough review of the basic principles of constitutional law. All constitutional law questions can be broken down into two issues. First, does the government have the power to act? And second, has the government violated a limit on its authority? Literally every aspect of constitutional law is about one of these two questions. Does the government have the power to act? Has the government violated a limit on its authority? Let me say a few words about each of these questions. As to the former question, does the government have the power to act? One of those basic principles of constitutional law is that the federal government can act only if it has express authority, whereas state and local governments can do anything except that which is prohibited by the Constitution. When I say the federal government can act only if it has express authority, this explains why Congress can act only if it can point to express or implied authority in the Constitution. There's no general authority of Congress to act just by saying be good for the country or serve the general welfare. The same is true with regard to the federal courts. A federal court can hear a case only if there's both constitutional and statutory authority. But when it comes to state and local governments, it's a very different story. State and local governments can do anything except that which is prohibited by the Constitution. This is often phrased in a more technical way as state and local governments have the police power. All that means is that state and local governments can do anything except for what's forbidden by the Constitution. Shouldn't surprise you then that it's often said that Congress and the federal government lack the police power. Just another way of saying what I've already pointed out. For Congress to act, it's got to always be able to point to authority in the Constitution. State and local governments can do anything unless it's prohibited by the Constitution. The second question that I identified is, has the government violated a limit on its power? All governments, at all levels, federal, state, and local, are constrained by the Constitution. These constraints take many forms. Most obviously, the rights in the Constitution are limits on government. The First Amendment, especially with regard to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, is a constraint on government. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is a constraint on government. Many of the provisions of the Bill of Rights focus on criminal procedure. The Fourth Amendment, limiting searches and arrests. The Fifth Amendment, such as the privilege against self-incrimination. The Sixth Amendment, which is about the rights of criminal defendants at trial. The Eighth Amendment, such as in the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. All of these are limits on government. Now, I'm not going to be covering the criminal procedure topics. By historical allocation, they're treated as a separate subject, but they're, of course, constitutional law, and they're limits on the government. Among the most important limits on the government are due process and equal protection. No government, at any level, can take away a person's life, liberty, or property without due process of law. No government at any level can deny any person equal protection of the laws. So whenever you're approaching constitutional law, whenever you're approaching a constitutional law exam question, or a constitutional law issue when you're practicing a lawyer, always remember you're focusing on one or both of two questions. First, does the government have the power to act? And if so, second, has the government violated a limit on its authority? I'm going to be covering the law with regard to the Constitution that applies this to each of these questions. I'm, over the course of 5 modules, going to look at powers and constraints. I'm going to begin in a module by looking at the powers of the federal government, the authority of the federal judiciary, of Congress, of the president in the executive branch. Then, second in a module, I'm going to look at intergovernmental powers, the relationship among the levels of government. What I'm especially focusing on here is limits on state and local government power, because of the existence of a national government in other states. In a third module, I want to talk generally about individual liberties under the Constitution. I want to cover some general principles that apply to all of the parts of the Constitution that deal with individual liberties. And I want to talk about individual liberties that basically are outside of the realm of due process and equal protection. In a fourth module, I want to talk about due process and equal protection. These are the guarantees of the 5th and 14th Amendments. I've already alluded to them. The government cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The government can't deny any person equal protection laws. And then finally, in the last module, I want to talk about the First Amendment. Obviously, the First Amendment is providing protections of individual liberties. The First Amendment is a constraint on government power. And the most important First Amendment rights are freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And I'm going to be covering those. In this way, my hope is, as I said, to write a comprehensive review of the principles of constitutional law, looking both at the powers of government and the constraints on government. I know that across the country, constitutional law is taught in many different ways. There are year-long constitutional law courses, sometimes in the first year, sometimes in the second. There are semester-long courses, sometimes focusing on powers and individual liberties, sometimes combining them. My hope is that over the course of these modules, I will cover all of the topics that are looked at in constitutional law courses, however they're organized in your law school.